Hello everyone, I am Sahid. Thank you for clicking this video. I'm very happy that you're here. Today I'll be continuing my chapter series on Blessings by chukwuebuka ibeh, and today I'll be reading part 2, chapter 10. Like my other chapter videos, I like to do a brief recap on sort of what I read in the previous chapter. And before I read today's chapter, I want to just say, I appreciate your continuous support and I hope that you stay all the way to the end to continue this reading journey with me. And I also want to say that if you're new here, please kindly watch my previous chapter videos as to give you a bit more idea of the previous chapter summaries and sort of how we got to the point in which I'll be reading about today. But to sort of go back, so chapter 9 sort of was mainly focused on Uzumaka, and particularly Uzumaka's dream when she sort of was sleeping. And I believe chukwuebuka ibeh did so well at being very descriptive and making me as a reader sort of visualize the things that were roaming around Uzumaka's sort of head and mind and her thoughts in the moment. So in the dream, she sort of has this horrible dream about this young boy that she saw dead, lying on a pavement, and at some point she see the author just say these very descriptive things of how she saw him. He was sort of bloated in the sun, left there, and his eyes were just opened. And in Igbo land, it was a sort of like a curse for a dead person's eyes to be open, because their soul is never fully rested. So these are things that the author includes in the dream. And then also, at some point, we have a moment in which she's yelling her younger son, Ekene, sort of name about 3 times. She's like, Ekene, 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 sort of yelling his name. But then that's when we realize, like, oh, wait, it's a dream because, her husband, Ngozi, is like, what's going on? Like, what is wrong with you? And then he mentions how she almost woke the whole neighborhood or street or something. And that's when I realized, oh, wait, this is a dream. But at first I was really worried in the whole scene because I was like, wait, what's going on? Like, But then we come to realize when we go to the scene, but before we go to the scene in which she was in the salon, it was, after that whole dream, she quickly ran to Ekene's room, sort of holding his hand and sort of crying, and with sort of Anazi in the back yelling at her. All she could was just cry, and it was just really sad seeing that. But then when we go to the salon scene, we come to realize that it was actually something that was going on in their, neighborhood, in their environment, and this has, obviously been something that's affecting Uzumaka's mind because um she has a salon in which she have different women who just kind of come and talk about things that are happening in the community, in the neighborhood. And so these things must have been roaming her mind or something. And there have been, certain cases about cultists, sort of, killing people, killing different type of people, even young people, and also reading how like sort of it's these cultists are mostly young boys and teenage boys was something that I think the author included to sort of emphasize on Uzumaka as a mother worries for the decisions that her son would possibly make, particularly Ekene, because Obifuna on the other hand is in boarding school, but she worries the most about Ekene because Ekene is completely opposite from Obifuna, and she sees things that he do sometimes and how sometimes he can be rebellious about certain things that she asks him to do, and so she has a sort of fear, and even hearing the news makes her just really sort of afraid of what could happen at any moment, especially because one of the recent killings happened close to her shop. It was like a few shops away before her, and reading that just made me like, oh yeah, she's definitely worried. And like any person, you would be worried if you're hearing stories like this. It's quite disturbing, but being aware of it makes you, want to take action. So we have a scene in which, towards the end, we see how, when Uzumaka sees Ekene sort of handshaking this one neighbor's son, and sort of seeing what he was doing, where she flogs him when he gets home, and she sort of feels sad doing this, but she feels as though doing this would make him realize not to, join bad groups and gangs in the community. And also, something that really triggered her to do that was because of, this, the story about the young boy dying. Actually, something was something that came through as one of the cultist victims was a young boy who died, and um, she sort of felt as though, um, maybe doing that would make sure that he doesn't get into that state, and also make sure he doesn't join like bad gangs. um and reading that just made me say, Uzamaka is just a mother who just deeply cares for her son. But at the same time, I don't support beating, but this is a time in which we're in an African household, so this is her way of sort of protecting her son. So it's completely, I guess I could sort of validate the reason why she's doing that. But and I think earlier I mentioned like it was a cultist victim. It might have been one of the cultists themselves, and they end up getting killed or something. I don't remember exactly. I'm literally taking all these things out of my head because I like to sort of remember what I read without going back. But yeah, so that's sort of my summary of the last chapter that we read. But please, if you want a better summary, or if you feel as though this sort of recap on what I read in chapter 9 in the previous chapter video, please go back to watch that video, as it gives you a good idea, because I do summarize after reading at the end. And so yeah, let's get into today's chapter on chapter 10. Part 2, Chapter 10. The conventional wisdom was that there was no better time to be careful than in SS2. As Obifuna wheeled his box through the second gates after the church, breathing in the warm air of the campus again after the session break, he felt a mix of elation and terror. It was Jeku, later that night, who explained the code. The first months of SS2 were regarded as the most precarious for the students, only a term away from their being passed the mantle of school leadership, the prefectships. They would have to get through the final lap of torture from the SS3 students as well as from the outgoing prefects before they handed over. Even worse, the school had decided for some odd reason to have the two most senior houses right next to each other, so that Obifuna could not successfully get through a day without a run-in with a bored SS3 student looking to punish him just for the fun of it. The strategy Jeku advised was to avoid trouble if he could, endure it if he couldn't, and take consolation in the countdown of months until they became prefects themselves, when the school and the world really would be at their feet. It seemed to Obifuna that with each new year, Hamatan announced itself earlier, and every time it seemed to sneak up on him. The wind colder and more vicious. The school had gone to bed one night in November, as it had every other night, and by the next morning the campus was enveloped in a fog so thick Obifuna could hardly make out figures within a few feet of him. At prayers, several boys turned up with their bed sheets wrapped around their shoulders, but the prefects were too cold themselves to bother punishing them. Obifuna dreaded touching water to his lips as he brushed his teeth, and dreaded even more having a bath. A crowd of boys swarmed the kitchen with buckets and tales of various allergies, only to be turned away by the kitchen staff. Wisdom suggested that they should jog around the field to stimulate inner heat, but Obifuna gave up after the first lap, worse than before, his ribs hurting. At the tap, he stood shivering as he watched his bucket fill with water, willing it in his mind to become warm. The bathroom complex near his house lacked its usual rowdiness. Many of the boys had gone back to bed after prayers, opting to skip morning baths. Some of them would ultimately go for rub and shine. The thought of rub and shine, in which hand and leg washing with cream and cologne application was substituted for a proper bath, had always disgusted Obifuna. But standing there at the tap with the cold sneaking itself around his shoulders, Obifuna seriously considered the prospect, if only for this one time. Very cold, Abby, someone said from behind. Obifuna turned to see Senior Kachi, the school's senior prefect. He had a towel wrapped around his waist and a sponge in his hand. Behind him, a boy from Obifuna's class held Senior Kachi's bucket of water. Obifuna ached at the stream rising from it. "Do you need hot water?" Senior Kachi said. Obifuna stared at him in shocked silence for a while before he nodded. "Follow me," Senior Kachi said. Turning towards the prefect quarters, Obifuna followed behind, consciously of the envious glances the other boys shot him. Senior Kachi's room was a square, airy space with 3 wooden framed beds, where the 2 deputy senior prefects and the 2 chapel prefects slept. There was a smaller, built-in room in the corner with a bed, which was Senior Kachi's. On the wall next the bunk was a socket. A ring boiler was connected to the socket and half sunk into a small bucket of water. Senior Kachi switched the socket off and motioned for Obifuna to take the water. Obifuna emptied the water into his bucket, relishing the heat that serenaded his face. "Thank you, Senior," he said. Senior Kachi did not respond. He had his back turned to Obifuna, silently observing the fog through the window. But as Obifuna made his way out, he turned at the main door to see Senior Kachi standing by the entrance to his room, looking at him. Obifuna came into wakefulness slowly. His eyes searched in the dark until they made out the silhouette of the face which was peering down at him. The breath smelled faintly of cigarettes. "Stand," Senior Kachi said in a quiet command. Obifuna propped himself up on his elbows. Senior Kachi stepped aside to give him room. His hands sunk in the side pockets of his baggy shorts. Obifuna retrieved his footwear from under his bed. When he made to grab a shirt, Senior Kachi stopped him. "Just come with me." He filed in behind Senior Kachi as they made for the door. A cold blast of air hit his face as he stepped into the corridor. All through the short walk down the hallway, Senior Kachi did not glance at him even once. They were near the base of the staircase, the darkest corner, when Senior Kachi stopped and turned to him. "Obi," he said simply. Obifuna looked at him. Even in the dark, he could tell that Senior Kachi's eyes were averted, his hand on his mouth. And because he would not act, Obifuna did. He inched his face forward, flushed, Senior Kachi's breath too loud in his ears. He did not make sense of the hands placed on his chest in resistance until his lips tasted air. His heart stomped in his chest as he waited for the next step. Senior Kachi's hands traveled across his head and tugged behind his ears as though to pull him close. but the senior prefect guided him downwards. Senior Kachi wore no briefs under his shorts. He smelled of lavender soap. Obifuna took him in his mouth, with a firm grip on his head, relaxing as he moved his tongue, occasionally coming up for air. He held on even as a rush of saltiness filled his mouth, a strange, nauseating taste. Senior Kachi pulled him up and tapped his head fondly, as one would a puppy, and told him to go back to bed. He did not know how long he slept, but he woke up the next morning with a new lightness of being. Here was his first real thing. During functions, as he was assigned task, he was constantly on the lookout for Senior Kachi, but Senior Kachi, who was dividing the SS1 boys into groups, did not meet his eyes. It was later, as he worked with the other boys harvesting cassava at the school farm, that he realized he was being avoided. What had been magical for him, what had been of auspicious significance, was for Senior Kachi a minor, necessary release. Obifuna had been merely unavailable too. He thought of it that night as he lay in bed struggling to sleep. Just before midnight, he felt a presence next to him and turned to see Senior Kachi. Again, Obifuna rose without a word, falling in line behind Senior Kachi, halting at the dark staircase, and pliantly descending to his knees. This scenario was repeated day after day, and yet nothing changed in Senior Kachi's public demeanor. With him, Obifuna was instinctively wounded. He understood the need to hide, especially when you were Senior Kachi, senior prefect, pride of the school, a shining star, with a reputation to maintain. And yet he couldn't help the resentful hurt he felt, and day after day he thought about putting an end to it, his resolve dissipating as soon as Senior Kachi showed up at his bedside and led him away. As it turned out, the decision was made for him without his having to try. One Sunday, Obifuna was nestled in bed with Senior Kachi, both avoiding chapel. He heard the call for the benediction from where he lay and watched from the window as the boys poured out in their white outfits. Senior Kachi was watching, too. "Take a look at this," he said after a while. Obifuna leaned forward to get a good view. Boys were strolling in every direction, but somehow he knew who Senior Kachi was talking to. Something about the distinctive carefree sway of his hips, the flutter of his wrist, made Obifuna chuckle. "Festus," he said. Senior Kachi sighed. "Is that his name?" Obifuna nodded. "That boy disgusts me," he said. Obifuna hummed and said nothing. "I see no reason why a boy would choose to behave like a girl." Obifuna remained quiet. Senior Kachi turned to him. "You never tell me about your girlfriend, Obi." Obifuna shook his head. "I don't have one." Senior Kachi looked surprised. "Why not? You need to get a girl, Obi." "Why?" Obifuna asked. He did not need to ask, but he did. "Because you need one," Senior Kachi said. He leaned away from the window and stretched out on his bed. "Don't get this thing into your head. It's just a game. Every boy should have a girlfriend." Obifuna stared at him. Senior Kachi leaned back on the bed and lay with his buttons undone, exposing his bare chest to Obifuna. Obifuna rose to his feet. He had a feeling in his stomach that he recognized as the early onset of nausea. and he found himself suddenly overwhelmed by the foul taste of Senior Kachi on those nights when Obifuna had gone onto his knees, his head held securely in Senior Kachi's hands. One time, he had been daring enough to ask Senior Kachi if he liked the feeling, and Senior Kachi said no. I only let you do it because you want to, but I don't like it. I'm not like you. Obifuna walked out of the room to his house. In front of his room, a quarrel had broken out between Festus and another boy. Festus had his hand wrapped around the boy's collar, thrusting his slightly bent head in the boy's face as he dared the boy to repeat the bad word he had called him. Obifuna stood a while watching them. He had always had a vague fascination, devoid of attraction, for Festus. His flamboyance was laced with confidence. He responded to mock catcalls with an exaggerated bathing of the eyelids, and the occasional taunts of homo were met with a swift, "Your dad taught me." He was once whipped for painting his nails with ink. Everyone used Vaseline to protect their lips from the harmattan, but Festus' application was shiny enough to draw stares. He laced conversation with words of endearment. Once, he asked Obifuna to pass him a notebook, darling, and Obifuna snapped, "I'm not your darling." In the silence that followed, with heads turning from every direction to stare, Festus looked him in the eye with a calmness that chilled Obifuna. He could tell that Festus saw through him, and he panicked for a second that Festus would say something. Obifuna remembered how, once, Festus had been walking down the house corridor, and a group of boys had begun taunting him as usual. In a move that seemed at once spontaneous and premeditated, Festus turned to one of the boys and said, "Even you, Oscar, after last night." And before Oscar could launch into a swift denial, Obifuna saw a momentary look of panic flash across his face. Although the other boys tactically laughed off the situation, Obifuna did not fail to notice the contrived ring to the sound, the awkward silence that followed, the slight distance they kept from Oscar on the railings afterwards. For one full week, Senior Kachi did not show up at his corner. Obifuna lay awake on most nights, longing for the sound of those light footsteps and the labored warm breathing on one side of his face, the hesitant tap. On the 8th day, he rose from his bed right after inspection and made his way to the prefect quarters. The night was brightly lit by a full moon, and its glow lent the room an ethereal appearance. Without Senior Kachi leading him, he felt less sure, more apparently. Without Senior Kachi leading him, he felt less sure, more apprehensive. At the door, he took a breath before he stepped in, wondering whether to loudly excuse himself in case one of the other seniors happened to be awake. Senior Kachi's door was slightly open. Obifuna inched forward when he heard the shuffling of feet. Perhaps Senior Kachi would be coming to him tonight after all. He turned around to go, but something made him pause and crouch behind a cupboard, waiting to see what would follow. He didn't have to wait long. It seemed, as barely seconds later, a figure that was not Senior Kachi emerged from the door. Obifuna took in the flutter of his wrist, the slight sway of his hip as he walked. He turned around briefly at the main door, and Obifuna caught a glimpse of the face. It was Festus, and, as expected, he looked extremely pleased with himself. And that is the end of chapter 10 of part 2. Oh, let's talk about it. Okay, so chapter 10, to sort of keep it short, mainly focuses on Obifuna and Senior Kachi's relationship. In the beginning, though, we sort of have to talk about the prefectship that's among the boarding school, and how certain students get to the point in which they could become a prefect, such like a student leader in the school. And after the talk about prefect, we get introduced to one of the prefects that goes by Senior Kachi. He's this shining star. He's this sort of popular student. He's one of the prefects, and you know, we have this scene in which it's getting colder. Harmattan season is getting worse. Every night it just seems to be getting worse, and then when the day rose, it just seemed colder than before, the night before. And when Obifuna was trying to take a shower, there was a senior, which is Senior Kachi. He happens to have one of his underclassmen boys helping him, and he could see the steaming hot water from Senior Kachi's bucket, and Obifuna was sort of looking, and then at some point Senior Kachi sort of offers him like, oh, do you want hot water? And Obifuna looks shocked because this is like a senior in SS3 who he didn't expect. He had this sort of view about him, and he didn't expect the senior to be offering him hot water. And so when he does that, he tells Obifuna to sort of come along with him, and they go to his, I believe, dormitory or his room, where he has sort of a space with other sort of prefects. They have the senior chapel prefect, and some other students in there, but they weren't in the room at the time. So when he goes in there, he sort of gives him the water, because he has like this like socket where he is able to get boiling water from, because this is like boiling, I forgot what it was called, but this boiling pot where you could boil water and then pour it into your bucket. And so he goes there, and then the senior, on his way, I believe when Obifuna was about to leave, the senior was sort of standing by the entrance of the door when Obifuna was trying to leave, sort of not letting him go on away. And he sort of like, I don't remember if he said for him to not go, or he was just like stand or something like that. But at some point he tells Obifuna to sort of follow him to this secret spot that's sort of below like the staircase. It's really dark, nothing, you can't really see anything. And then they have this very intimate scene, and honestly, a part of me knew we were gonna happen like this at some point in the book. But it happened in chapter 10. But in boarding school, it's common because it's a bunch of boys, and crazy things happen in boarding school. And so this down low, quote unquote straight boy, Senior Kachi, basically uses Obifuna for sort of, what we read about, this nasty thing, and just for him to be able to release, basically. And after that day, this was something that was huge to Obifuna. Obviously, this is his first real thing. He has never done something like this with a boy, and so, after that happened, he noticed that Senior Kachi was trying to avoid him in a way, and he after expressing this, something that made him feel good in a way, he kept looking out to see if he could find Senior Kachi, but he realized that Senior Kachi was just ignoring him and trying not to be in the same sort of space with him in a way. But despite that, Senior Kachi keeps coming back for more, and this sort of goes on day after day. And Obifuna slowly starts to question things, and excuse me, Obifuna slowly starts to question things and starts to notice that well, maybe he didn't exactly notice it, but we could tell that he sort of, actually no, he does sort of notice it, because when he asked him that, does he enjoy what's going on between um him and Tsunekachi, he sort of like, no, I'm not like you, like or something like that. He said that he does it because Obifuna likes it, but he's not like him. And I was just like, what? Like, it was just so weird. But this is literally what DL, down low men, do, so that was not surprising. But I was like, oh, this is sad. But then also, we read about sort of his homophobia in a way, and I'm pretty sure it's just sort of a way to be. Is it like sort of insecurity and internalized hate for himself, and so he used it on other queer people. Specifically, he uses it on this one openly very feminine boy in the boarding school named Festus, and Festus is like this boy that's often getting bullied in school due to his identity, and so there was a time in which him and Obifuna were together, and he sort of makes this homophobic comment in which he says, how can a man sort of behave like a girl or something like that. And it was just really weird, hearing that, because after you, as a man, had this weird, very intimate moment with another boy, how can you say that, Festus, okay, but anyways, y'all get it. But after reading now, it's just like, oh, please. And this just really showed me that, oh yeah, he's definitely insecure in himself. He's this obviously down low, want to be straight, but deep down you know that you're attracted to the same sex. But let's not talk about that. But basically, this boy gets bullied, and Tsunekachi is also one of the bullies, because basically what he says is very showing of his views. But anyways, him and Obifuna continue to do certain things, and after a week or so, he wasn't showing up like he used to, and I think Obifuna gets the urge to sort of go to his senior corner or senior room or something like that. So he goes there, and before he gets there, I think he was sort of, he heard a feet sort of walking towards his direction, and then it was, guess who it was? It was Festus. Festus sort of catches him, and Festus looked very pleased. Meaning, I think when the author said that, in a way, I believe that's like a way of saying that Festus sort of clocked Obifuna's teeth, or it's a way of saying that Festus knew what was going on between Obifuna and Tsunekachi, because what is Obifuna going to go do with Tsunekachi? Okay, but anyway, but yeah, that's how chapter 10 ended. That's basically the summary of today's video. If you enjoyed this video, please kindly subscribe, like, comment. Thank you. Bye.